I was there. I felt out of place. I watched him as he struggled to breathe, knowing that every breath he took just increased the pain as his arms pulled against those nails on the cross. And I wept. It wasn't right. You see, it should have been me. I should go back a bit. My name is Yeshua Barabbas. In your tongue, that is Jesus, Son of the Father, or Jesus, Son of the Teacher. No, I wasn't that Jesus. I was Jesus, the political activist, the freedom fighter, though some would call me a murderer and a thief. But I believed that the day of the Lord had come, that God was going to save us. I believed that this was the day of the Lord that Isaiah spoke about when he said, "The proud will be humbled." Zephaniah said it would be a day when the wrath of God would come against the armies and the fortresses of darkness. I longed for that day, and I wanted to be a part of what God was doing in that day, bringing salvation to his people. And I wanted my sword to be his instrument of vengeance against our oppressors. My heroes were the insurrectionists of old. Moses, who killed the Egyptian. Ehud, the left-handed leader, who went in to see the king of Eglon and thrust his sword all the way through his body. Of Deborah and Jael, the mothers of Israel, who killed the king of Canaan with a tent peg through his head. Even as a child, I learnt the song of Deborah. You who ride on white donkeys, sitting on your saddle blankets, and you who walk along the road, take heed to the voice of the singers at the watering places, proclaiming the victory of the Lord, the victory of the villages of Israel. I longed for God to bring us that victory against those evil, unclean, idolatrous Romans. I longed to see Israel as a free nation, God's nation again. But looking back, perhaps more than anything else, I wanted revenge and bloodshed. I longed for those Romans to experience the defeat and death that the people of Israel had experienced at their hands. I longed for them to know that feeling of hopelessness and powerlessness that comes in the face of an enemy that is just so big. And I'd done my part. I'd killed some of those Romans. I'd even killed some of our own people who had decided to work with the Romans, to side with them. I thought of them as traitors to Israel and traitors to God, and so they deserved what they got. And I wasn't alone. I found others that, like me, were willing to do anything for freedom. And we would meet and talk in hushed voices in dark places and share stories of the assassins and the insurrectionists of old who had managed to change the course of history through the things that they'd done. We'd even managed to steal some of the Romans' weapons and learnt how to use them. I'd even managed to arrange for some of the lower-level guards to be bribed, because one day we hoped that we would be able to kill those Roman rulers and take the reins of government back into our own hands. And we went out to the countryside. It was safer there. And we preached rebellion and revolution to people who, like us, felt desperate, who felt oppressed, who were angry and tired and wanted to do something. But then everything fell apart. I'd made a plan based on the defeat that the Romans saw at Cowdine Forks. And just as happened then, I imagined that we could do something similar. And so we found a troop of Romans And we had them going through a narrow ravine and sought to block their exit so that we could just rain down on them from the cliffs above. But I'd underestimated them, underestimated their strength and their skill and their numbers. And it wasn't long before most of my men were killed and the rest of us were captured. And so they took me off and imprisoned me to await trial. I knew how this would end. They would shame me. They would strip me. They would flog me. They would beat me. They would humiliate me. They would do all that they could to make those that had seen me as a potential leader, to help them realize that it was a waste of time. And then ultimately they would try me, find me guilty, and crucify me, and strip me and hang me up on a cross and put me on the road where everybody could see what happens to those people who are foolish enough to try and stand against the great Roman Empire. Well, the courts must have been busy because it felt like weeks, maybe months, that we sat in a dark, cold room, losing weight, losing hope. But then one day, that day, the door opened and a guard came in and called my name and told me that Pontius Pilate, the governor, wanted to see me. Another one came in and unshackled my legs, and they led me out, led me through these dark corridors and up steps, and eventually into the sunlight. It blinded me. I couldn't see, I couldn't think, but by the time my eyes and my brain had adjusted, I realized that they'd brought me to the steps of the governor's palace. And there, just a few steps above me, was Pontius Pilate himself, a man that I had longed to kill so many times. And on the other side of him was another prisoner. He had guards with him too, but it was as though they were there to hold him upright. He was a mess. Beaten, bloodied, bruised. And he looked at me. He looked at me with a look that I will never forget. His gaze, it pierced my soul, and it was strangely tender. And then Pilate stood up in front of the crowd, and he said, "People of Israel, as is my custom, on the feast of the Passover, I will release to you a prisoner, and I'm giving you a choice. Would you like me to release to you this man, Jesus Barabbas, a rebel, a traitor, a man who stood against the Romans and caused all sorts of trouble for you? Or would you have me release this man, Jesus, that you call Messiah, the King of the Jews?" Well, I looked at this bloodied, bruised man again and wondered, Jesus, Messiah, King of the Jews? What had he done that Pilate would be willing to free me in his place? It made no sense. Now, I'd heard some stories about the person that some thought was the Messiah, but I hadn't been impressed. He seemed more concerned with people's health and their beliefs, how lovingly they looked at other people, and he spoke nothing about freedom from the Romans. And then Pilate spoke up again and said that he and Herod together had examined this other Jesus and found him innocent of anything that required conviction. And so he offered the people again. He said, "Now, do you want me to release to you this Barabbas, me, this man who is a traitor and a thief and a murderer? Or do you want me to release to you this man who we found innocent?" And the crowd, they shouted, "Barabbas! They shouted my name. It was incomprehensible. I mean, if we'd been in the countryside, maybe people would be willing to somehow identify with me. But here in the city, no one would be willing to identify with someone that had opposed the Romans. But they did. They cried my name. Well, just at that moment, a man came rushing past me and up the steps to Pontius Pilate. He was close enough to me that I could hear what he was saying. He said he had come from Pilate's wife and that she had had a dream. And in that dream, she'd seen this other Jesus and that she knew he was innocent. And she begged Pilate not to have anything to do with convicting this man. So Pilate, he stood up and he took some water and he put it on his hands and he said, "If you want, I will release to you this Barabbas, but I will have nothing to do with the shedding of innocent blood." And someone in the crowd shouted out, "Let his blood be on our heads and on the heads of our children." And with that, Pilate freed me. I was unshackled. The guards pushed me off. I was free to go. I went down into the crowd. The crowd didn't even seem to notice me. You see, they hadn't been calling out for my freedom. They'd been crying out so that that other Jesus would be convicted, and Pilate sent him off to the soldiers to be crucified. Well, later that day, I went to the road where I knew those crucifixions were going to be taking place. And I went there, struggling to understand who was this man that they called Messiah, King of the Jews, and why was he on a cross suffering? And I looked at him, and as I say, I wept, because I knew it should have been me there and not him. And then I remembered what the prophet Isaiah had said. He will be counted among the rebels. How true that was.